Analog horror is a genre filled to the brim with indie creators. All, well, most at least, with a unique story to tell. However, while these are technically horror short films, they sometimes lack the mystery that the horror genre can often provide the audience. And while we can question why they tell the stories that they do, it's rarely an inquiry into what the story is. EXP Goat's brilliant Alice in Dreams series is different, however. I think it takes the mind of someone with psychosis to properly dissect every minute detail to both answer why and what the story is. And this only continues with the second entry. And as a video essayist and a sufferer of psychosis, I feel it is my specific job to analyze this series. That is the mission of today, friends. To determine both what the story is telling, and then ask ourselves why the story exists in the first place. To ask ourselves what the nature of psychosis, its dissociating nature, and the archaic treatments that were once utilized. If you haven't seen the first video in this series, that's okay. We'll be doing a brief summary in this video. Furthermore, if you haven't seen this masterpiece of analog horror, I highly suggest you do, as this will spoil the entirety of it. At the very least, watch Support EXP Goats after you watch this video. Okay? Okay. So then, if you're ready, I think it's time we dive into the looking glass and see what's on the other side. Alice in Dreams The Looking Glass opens up on a lobotomy, of which we discussed in the previous video. To summarize, we said that a girl named Alice was forcefully lobotomized and left with little to no identity. Because she was deemed to be crazy, she had her rights taken away, left alone in an empty bed. The Looking Glass solidifies this, as we see a girl this time being lobotomized. What we see next is a medical sheet telling us things that I already theorized about. Take a look. We see that Alice does indeed suffer from psychosis, in the form of its most infamous illness, schizophrenia. Now, the history of schizophrenia is interesting, and while I fully broke it down in my Explaining Away Psychosis video, what we specifically want to look at here is the second part of the sheet. The patient also experiences bouts of violence. People, oftentimes girls, would often be slapped with a mental illness label simply for being outspoken, or outside of society's norms. Schizophrenia is an illness that has seen many different transformations in its definition, with violence being used as a previous indicator of the disease. Now, this isn't to say that Alice here doesn't actually suffer from psychosis. I personally believe she does, but what I am saying here is I'm about to spoil an episode of BoJack Horseman. Skip to this timestamp to avoid it. BoJack's grandmother was lobotomized. The reasoning for this is because she was simply depressed and grieving over the loss of her son. This was typical of girls and women back in the mid-1900s, to be subjected to lobotomization simply for being sad or angry. All you needed to be deemed as crazy was to not fit within societal norms. To not listen to what others tell you, you have to behave like. The Looking Glass even confirms this, with it saying Alice is now fit to live with society after a successful lobotomy. Her mental state improving is code for she no longer acts out. So whether or not she actually suffers from schizophrenia is seemingly inconsequential to these doctors. She was going to get lobotomized either way. But then there's something interesting written. A white rabbit came for her. Odd to have that written, right? And honestly, I have no explanation for this right now. Maybe I'll come up with something during the video. I do want to look at this association from reality a bit, as I think it's important. Longtime fans of the channel will be familiar with the term self-disorder, a phenomenon which is the most base level of dissociation. I won't talk about it in full here, as I've already discussed it in many other videos, but I do implore you to either watch those videos or look up the term for yourself. It can be crucial for early detection of psychosis as a whole. We then see Alice play with a small kitten, and EXP Goat's impeccable design continues to shine through, with realistic images composited onto more obvious drawings and animations, with a very creepy dramatic effect. We see Alice look into a mirror, reaching out a hand to her reflection. Perhaps this is her coming to terms with who she is now. A confused girl who underwent a torturous procedure and is now left with little of her previous self. This is further illustrated by a shot of what is presumably her real form, Alice Lydell, as opposed to the imaginary Alice. Alice wakes up in an identical room. Is what I would say, except it appears she is on the other side of the looking glass, with the paintings filled instead with animals as opposed to people. This scene has me thinking about the theme of this episode. Where the previous one was pretty strictly about psychosis and Alice's lobotomy, the end of that first video previewed what's to come. The aftermath, yes, but also her identity. It's no coincidence that she looks into the mirror and slips further down the rabbit hole. And while it makes logical sense that Through the Looking Glass would be the next episode because of the original Wonderland story, I don't think EXP Go would make another episode just for the sake of doing it. Rather, I think it was intentional to tell a very specific story of identity. Upon drinking the potion to what I'm inferring is an allusion to being forced to take different medications and treatments, she is shrunk down to a smaller size, made to feel little. Then we have Alice in bed, the real Alice. And the theme of identity continues as we see her face completely gone, with blood everywhere. A clear allusion to her fractured self after her forced lobotomy. We even see the straps in the bed removed in the second image, so this is clearly the aftermath of her operation. There is blood on the chessboard as we are shot back into Alice's mindscape, with a chess piece, a pawn specifically, that has only teeth and breathes heavily and painfully. For me, as this comes right after we see blood with the real Alice on the bed to a scene of blood on the chessboard, this pawn piece is an allegory for Alice herself. Without a face, mentally bloodied, struggling to breathe. She looks down at this new, lobotomized version of herself, something you can hardly call a person, and she looks sad. Sad at what she has become. This shows a sort of personality split, with an internal Alice screaming for help, unable to move or properly speak, and then her presenting self, a pawn that does nothing but behave and breathe, that doesn't cause a ruckus or misbehave, a peaceful pawn for the system and society as a whole, and most importantly, as any pawn should be, obedient. Then Alice goes through a piece of what I assume is the looking glass and is again transported to another part of her mindscape. She is introduced to a sits-together house with eyes always watching her. Inside we see a set of conjoined twins, and my interpretation here is that these are two people that Alice met while at the mental asylum. With nowhere in society to go and an age that didn't understand them, they were forced into an institution, one that surely mistreated them. Likely before that, as we see with the puppet show, they were stage performers, labeled as freaks, whose only job was to entertain the masses, just because they were born different. At the end, we see their presumed fate, which likely took place at least some type of hospital. They received a likely experimental procedure to separate them, resulting in their deaths. As we see the bloody paintings now over their faces, of which were previously covered with regular portraits. Which is something I find interesting, and again goes back to the episode's theme of identity. They were not allowed to be themselves, or show their metaphorical faces. Instead, they were forced to adorn new personalities, again for the freak show they were a part of. They were never allowed to grow up normally, develop their own personalities, because society didn't understand them. Because society dictated that they should only be relegated to a sideshow at a circus, meant only to ridicule them. You just can't properly form a personality when your entire life has been in ridicule, when your entire life has been on display for some show. I think it's why so many child actors end up how they do, although obviously this case is much worse. And I forgot to put in the script, little voiceover note here. The splitting of the two conjoined twins could also be an allusion to Alice's lobotomy and her mind being split, which we kind of get into in the next part of the script. So I just wanted to add that in there, but yeah. Moving on, we see a brain being split into two, which while also being a literal interpretation of schizophrenia's phonemic meaning of split mind, is more about the lobotomy itself. As you see in the caption, mutilation is not a cure, it is hell. I think this line speaks for itself. We then see Alice in real life before transitioning to Dream Alice, with what I assume is Humpty Dumpty staring at her. Someone please leave a comment to who this would be in the Alice in Wonderland story. This, to me, based on the angle and closeness of the face, seems like an interpretation of the nurses and doctors looking down at her. Something she comes to understand is all part of a story. This is to say, she begins to understand her world and reality as all being part of a fairy tale, which I assume is something she's sometimes always done, but now that problem has been exacerbated, evidenced by the scene becoming a more crude line drawing. Because of the lobotomy, her reality is peeling itself away, and we then see a haunting poem in Spanish, which translates to, "Few are the warriors who are left standing in a battle. You cling to something intangible. Will you be able to create the wall? Only then will you be invincible. Destroy the demon and you will find freedom. Beware that which you will face." You know, I had ideas of what the ending meant, something I will get to, but I think this poem almost confirms that theory for me. Alice now sees herself as a warrior in battle, presumably clinging to the idea of being normal, something intangible. It is only once she accepts she is sadly different, especially after the lobotomy, and creates that wall for traditional morals, that she'll become invincible and destroy the demon, to find her freedom. Again, we'll get more into this, but I think it should be rather obvious as to the identity of the enemy she should be aware of facing. The doctors. We see the Eggman dead with a crack in his head. Time to begin. The gate has been opened. I wonder what Alice in the real world is doing. It is time to face the Queen, a sheep. Someone who did all this because they were normalized to believe it was the right thing, without ever once questioning its inhumane cruelty. I'm talking, of course, about lobotomy. And it seems here that the Queen is representative of the head of the hospital, or a doctor, the final boss, if you would. After all, this is just a story anyway, right? Alice cries, most likely relenting at what she's about to do. But she no longer has control of her hands. And there's a dragon. She must slay the dragon. We see the real Alice outside of her room. As she looks in the mirror, she's not herself, but this fictionalized version of herself. The one from her dreams. The one from the story. The lobotomy tool, the one that took away her identity, becomes a sword within this mirror. A weapon to slay the dragon. The title Vorpal Memory comes up, which means sharp memory. It is Alice recollecting the memories she has, however brief or blurry, of the lobotomy. As she becomes a warrior with her sword, a sad expectation sets in. She is going to kill the staff of this hospital. Alice went down to the darkest part of the mind, the basement of the subconscious. Unaware of what she is really doing, she continues down the stairs of her soul, with a mind that no longer can comprehend reality. She stares at a young girl in bed, perhaps a version of herself before the lobotomy, as upon seeing it she loses her face again, and her eyes become hollow. The words sprawled on screen haunt me to this day. Who am I? It shows her escape from her bed, from her restraints. She is free. She regains herself, or should I say the storybook version of herself, and slays the dragon. But these are not the sounds of a sword. No. These are the sounds of a pick. So unbeknownst to her, she is killing a living person with the very tool that was used to take away her mind. She flees from the hospital. Or perhaps she loses her real self after this brutal act, forever falling down the rabbit hole. We see the dragon cut to pieces, dead. And as she becomes the queen, we realize that was never the final boss, but rather the new persona she would become, with the slain dragon's head now in her grip. And then she returns to sleep. Episode over. I want to make something clear. Killing people is almost never okay. And it is clear here that the real Alice killed at least one person, presumably the doctor who did her lobotomy, or perhaps the head of the hospital. And I can't really justify that. It's up to you whether or not she was justified in that action. If she should inflict the same pain that was inflicted upon her. For me, I'm not even sure what side I'm on. But I can't say this. I understand it. As I've described in this video, her lobotomy shattered her mind, both literally and metaphorically. Her identity is fractured, holding on by a thread, to the point where she adopts a delusion as her new persona. Perhaps she always believed she was a fairy tale character, and the lobotomy only exacerbated that. But my personal belief is that she wouldn't adopt that delusion so completely, so wholeheartedly, if her original personality wasn't forcefully broken. She has no choice in believing her delusion because her brain is grasping for a new persona so badly, and the one it happens to latch onto is the one that wasn't destroyed, the one that remained intact, the fairy tale. This means her actions, her reality, was simply killing a dragon. That in her mind, she didn't kill a person and probably would never do that consciously. Maybe that's my personal bias, however, as someone with schizoaffective disorder myself. But psychotic people are not inherently dangerous people. And if they ever become violent, it is usually because they don't know what they're doing. That their reality is so warped that they can simply believe they're slaying an evil dragon. And when you pair that with the pain, rage, and disassociation that comes with the lobotomy, well, I at least understand she had no concept of what she was doing. That because of her lobotomy, she no longer understood herself or her reality. That because of her lobotomy, she truly became a fairy tale character. That this was all part of the story. One that was written without her consent. And, as always, thank you for watching.